The morning sun beat down on the barren Texas ranch as a group of Japanese women POWs shuffled out of the transport truck. Gaunt, bruised, and exhausted, they moved like ghosts, eyes cast downward. Behind them, the heavy boots of American cowboys stomped, their rifles slung across their shoulders. The prisoners braced for the usual threats. What they hadn't expected was the sight that greeted them as they crossed into the compound. A cowboy, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a weathered grin, casually threw his rifle to the side. He wiped his brow and, with the most unexpected of gestures, extended a hand to the nearest prisoner, offering her a cigarette. The women froze. Was this a trick? A humiliating mockery? Or had their enemies, the very men they feared most, just broken protocol in a way that would unravel everything they'd been told about captivity? The transport truck rumbled to a stop in the dry, open expanse of the Texas ranch. The women, tired and gaunt from the brutal journey, had been herded off the truck like cattle. The air felt thick with dust, the harsh sun baking the earth beneath their feet. They were a ragged group, some barely able to stand on their own, others with faces hollowed from starvation and sleepless nights. They had been brought to this foreign land, a land that felt like a cruel stretch of the imagination. It had been sold to them as a place of torment, where their captors would humiliate and break them. But as the truck doors swung open and they were ushered out onto the land, nothing felt real. The vastness of the open fields, the hum of quiet cattle in the distance, and the rough-hewn barns before them seemed like a distant dream. The guards who had accompanied them were not the twisted figures of their nightmares. No, these were men in worn cowboy hats and dusty boots, their faces weathered by the harsh elements. They stood in small clusters, rifles slung over their shoulders as though it was nothing more than a casual afternoon. There were no yells, no commanding orders. The silence between the women and the men felt almost suffocating, as if they were all suspended in a moment too absurd to be true. Then, to their horror, one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered cowboy with a grizzled face, broke away from the group. He approached the nearest woman with a steady, unhurried pace, his eyes fixed on hers. Without any warning, he took off his wide-brimmed hat, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and offered her a cigarette. The gesture was as simple as it was shocking. A cigarette. He handed it to her like she was a fellow human, not an enemy soldier, not a captive. His hands, steady but marked by the rough labor of his life, held out the small paper cylinder. For a moment, the world seemed to collapse around them. The woman stared at the offer, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been told that Americans were monsters, that they were cruel and without mercy. But here was this man, extending kindness without any apparent malice. The woman's body froze. The heat of the sun no longer mattered. The smell of sweat, of earth, of horses, and hay seemed to vanish in the face of that one simple act. Could it be a trap? A mockery? Was this part of some cruel plan to break their spirits? She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, unsure whether to reject or accept the gesture. Her mind, filled with the propaganda of the war and the warnings of death and torture, told her that such an act of kindness could only be a trick. She hesitated, her hands trembling at her sides. The other women around her were equally paralyzed, staring at the man, unsure of what to do. The cowboy waited. There was no sneer, no jeer, just an outstretched hand, offering something small, something that they had all been denied for so long. And yet it felt like it was too much. It was too much humanity, too much compassion, from the very people they had been taught to fear. The silence stretched between them, thick with confusion and fear. Finally, one of the women, still too weak to speak, moved forward. She reached out and took the cigarette, her fingers brushing against the cowboy's rough skin. For a moment, their gazes locked. and the world outside their small, fragile exchange seemed to blur away. It was as though a small, imperceptible shift had occurred. The barrier between enemy and prisoner was suddenly fractured, but the question remained unanswered. The confusion, the fear, the disbelief continued to flood their senses. It was only the beginning of what would be a much longer journey, a journey of realizing the complexities of human interaction, the fragility of beliefs, and the pain of disillusionment. And for now, they stood frozen, trembling in the heat, struggling to make sense of the moment that had just shattered their understanding of the world. The women had been prepared for this moment, or at least they thought they had. For years, they had been indoctrinated with one singular truth: surrender was the greatest disgrace. It was dishonor beyond measure. The stories had been endless. Stories of American captors who would strip them of their dignity, their womanhood, their very souls. They had been taught that the enemy was a faceless beast, devoid of mercy, driven by a blind hatred that would stop at nothing to break them. In their training, there were no exceptions. The Americans, like all enemies, were to be feared and reviled above all else. Their teachers had spoken of the Americans in terms that chilled the soul. They were barbarians, they had said. They were animals, driven by the need to destroy and humiliate. They would torture, mock, and degrade them until they were nothing more than broken shells of their former selves. The lessons were harsh, drilled into them from the moment they stepped into their first training camp. There was no room for weakness, no room for empathy. The narrative was clear: their enemies were monsters, incapable of mercy, incapable of anything but cruelty. And so, these women had prepared themselves, mentally and emotionally. They steeled themselves for the horrors they had been told to expect. They knew the price of survival would be humiliation, and they had resolved to bear it with dignity, to endure whatever pain came their way, for the emperor, for honor, and for country. In their minds, the Americans were not just enemies, they were monsters who had to be fought at all costs, with every ounce of strength they had left. But now, standing on the Texas ranch, the reality was starting to unravel. The same men they had been taught to hate, to fear, to despise, these same men were treating them not as broken enemies, but as human beings. The cowboy who had offered the cigarette, the quiet guards who handed them food, the medic who had tended to their wounds, each action had seemed to strip away the certainty of their beliefs. This was not what they had been taught to expect. As the days passed, the weight of their teachings continued to pull at them, threatening to keep them locked in the prison of their own minds. They would lie awake at night, staring at the wooden beams above their heads, trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they were experiencing. They had been raised in a world where to be captured meant the loss of everything: honor, dignity, self-worth. But here, in this strange place, they were being offered something they had never expected: kindness. How could this be? How could the Americans, the very same people who had been painted as monsters, treat them with care? The question gnawed at them, tearing at their resolve. They had been taught to fear them, to see them as nothing but enemies who must be vanquished. But here, in this strange new world, the lines were blurring, and they were left questioning everything they had ever known. The first taste of humanity came not in grand gestures, but in the smallest of moments. A cowboy offering a cigarette, a medic wiping the blood from a woman's arm without mockery or disdain. These were not the actions of an enemy bent on destruction. No, these were the actions of men who saw them as human beings, and that realization, small though it was enough to shake them to their core. This internal conflict would continue to shape their experience on the ranch. The fear, the confusion, and the disbelief were not easily shaken. But each small act of kindness, each small crack in their armor, began to plant a seed of change. They weren't sure what it meant yet, but they could no longer ignore the truth in front of them. Their captors were not monsters, and that fact, more than any other, would shape the course of their journey. The days that followed were quiet, unnervingly so. The POWs were led through their new routines, moving like ghosts through the sprawling ranch. The sun beat down, the air thick with dust, but it was the stillness of it all that unsettled them most. There was no shouting, no harsh commands, no beating of weapons against iron bars, no metal clanging, no constant reminder that they were prisoners. Here, there were just the soft sounds of cattle in the distance and the rhythmic shuffle of their own tired feet against the dirt. It was almost peaceful, too peaceful, a strange contrast to the chaos they had known before. The Americans, for the most part, kept their distance. The guards would pass by occasionally, but they spoke in low voices, their tones calm and measured. They didn't look at the women like objects to be broken. Instead, there was a strange air of indifference, as though the POWs were just another part of the landscape. Yet, in the quiet moments between work assignments and meals, more and more acts of unexpected kindness began to surface, each one chipping away at the walls the women had built inside themselves. One morning, as they were herded toward the mess hall, one of the cowboys stopped them. He was older, with a thick beard and a gentle smile, his face etched with the wear of a hard life. "You ladies been eating well?" he asked, looking over each of them with an almost fatherly concern. The words hit them like a shock. This man, who should have been a monster in their eyes, was worried about their hunger. The very same man who, just a few days ago, had pointed a rifle at them, was now asking if they were well fed. For a moment, none of the women could respond. They had been conditioned to believe that no one cared about their well-being, least of all their captors. But here was a man who did, and it wasn't just words. Over the next few days, the cowboys began to show more signs of kindness. One cowboy, a younger man with sharp eyes and a nervous smile, offered a woman a cup of water without being asked. Another went out of his way to make sure that the women were fed, offering them fresh bread and fruits they had never imagined eating again. There was even one instance when a cowboy, during a routine inspection, noticed a woman's thin wrist and gently suggested she wear a sweater to protect herself from the cold. This simple, everyday concern left them reeling. Each small act felt like a crack in the foundation of everything they had been taught. In a world where they had been prepared for violence and disrespect, this kindness was incomprehensible. They had been taught that to surrender was to lose everything, that capture meant being stripped of one's dignity. Yet these men, these barbarians, were treating them with something they had never expected: care. The psychological toll was immediate. The POWs felt their resolve begin to crumble with every act of kindness they witnessed. For years, they had believed that suffering was a sign of loyalty, that it was the price one paid for survival and honor. But now, they were being shown that mercy didn't diminish their strength. It was as if the world they had known was being upended. Each gesture of care, whether it was a piece of bread or the offer of a kind word, forced them to confront their own beliefs and the truths they had been raised to accept. Some of the women began to falter. The mental battle inside them was fierce, and it left them exhausted. They wanted to resist, to hold on to the honor they had been taught to uphold. But how could they deny the humanity they were seeing? Could they really continue to hold on to their hatred of these men when they were the ones offering comfort and assistance? The uncertainty gnawed at them, the questions swirling faster than they could answer them. What did it mean to be treated with dignity by those who had once been their enemies? It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about who they were and who their captors truly were. In the following days, the emotional toll began to settle heavily upon the women. They had been taught to believe in one harsh truth: surrender was disgrace, and survival meant bearing the burden of cruelty without complaint. Their experiences up until now had been proof of this lesson. They had braced themselves for the worst, had steeled themselves for the violence they had been told would come. But here, in this strange place, it was not violence that greeted them. It was kindness. Every act of mercy, every offer of food or drink, every quiet gesture of care felt like an assault on their beliefs. The internal conflict was palpable. On one hand, the women were torn by pride. The very core of their identity had been built around the idea of suffering with dignity. To accept kindness, to accept that they could be treated as human beings by their captors, felt like an abandonment of everything they had ever known. The teachings of Bushido ran deep in their veins, and they had been told time and time again that to bend, to accept mercy, was to dishonor their ancestors, to dishonor themselves. But on the other hand, they were human. They were hungry, tired, and broken by war, and survival demanded that they accept what was offered. The struggle between pride and survival played out in their minds each day until it seemed to bleed into everything they did. One woman, who had been particularly silent since their arrival, found herself at a crossroads when she was handed a bowl of warm stew by a cowboy. The rich smell hit her senses first. It was a fragrance she hadn't experienced in months, maybe even longer. It was a simple meal, a humble one, but for her, it was more than food. It was the first thing in weeks that wasn't a cruel joke, wasn't another way to mock her humanity. She hesitated, her hand trembling as it reached for the bowl. She remembered the slogans of her homeland, the phrases she had memorized in training. Endure for the emperor, suffer, and be strong. These words rang in her mind, louder than the hunger in her stomach. She could feel the weight of them pressing against her chest as she stared down at the stew. Could she accept this? Could she really swallow this food from the enemy's hand? The woman's pride warred with her body's need. She could feel the walls she had spent her entire life building around her collapse with each passing second. Finally, she took the bowl, brought it to her lips, and drank. The warmth spread through her, and the taste filled her with an overwhelming sense of relief, not just from hunger, but from a deep, aching exhaustion. She swallowed. The bite of food, feeling like a betrayal, yet it also felt like salvation. It wasn't just the food. It was the way the cowboys treated them with respect, with care. They weren't just being fed. They were being seen as individuals, not as enemies, not as objects. The act of kindness, of being treated as human beings, felt strange. The women were used to being nothing more than soldiers, pawns in a war too big to understand. But here, in this odd place of discomfort and unexpected hospitality, they were starting to feel like more. As the sun dipped low over the ranch, the women began to speak more openly. They exchanged looks, shared their fears, and, slowly, what they had been taught to believe was crumbling. And in its place, something new was starting to grow. They could no longer ignore the humanity in their captors. The question was no longer about survival. It was about what kind of people they were becoming and whether they could find a way to accept the kindness offered to them without losing themselves in the process. As the days passed, the changes in the camp became undeniable. The small, fleeting moments of kindness that had once felt like the exception were now becoming a regular part of the women's experience. There was no grand, dramatic shift, but rather a quiet accumulation of human connections, subtle, understated gestures that began to reshape the way they saw themselves and their captors. It wasn't just the food, the medical care, or the moments of silence that marked their days. It was the small conversations, the gentle exchanges, the shared smiles that seemed to slip through the cracks of their hardened minds. One afternoon, as the women sat in the shadow of the barn, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air, a cowboy approached one of them. He was older, with deep lines etched into his face, and a gentle smile that seemed to reach beyond the surface. He held a piece of bread in his hand, broken from a larger loaf. His voice was soft when he spoke, the words simple but kind. "You hungry?" he asked, his tone unhurried, as though the question had more to do with concern than obligation. The woman stared at the bread, her stomach already full from the last meal. She had been trained to refuse food from the enemy, to reject anything that came from the hands of those who had imprisoned her. But something about the way he spoke without urgency, without any hidden agenda, made her pause. The thought of refusing felt wrong. Tentatively, she took the bread, her fingers brushing against his hand for a brief moment. There was no hostility, no mockery in his touch. It was just human. For a brief second, she felt a shift inside of herself, as though the walls that had kept her safe from this world, the walls that had been built to protect her from vulnerability, were starting to crack. The bread was more than just food. It was a bridge, a small act of understanding, a shared moment between two people who were supposed to be enemies. She looked up at him and, for the first time since her capture, she didn't see a guard or a soldier. She saw a man, just as tired, just as human as she was. It was these small exchanges, these human moments that began to blur the lines between captor and captive. They were simple: a passing glance, a shared joke, a soft word of encouragement. But each moment carried with it the weight of something more profound. The women had been taught that their enemies were cruel, that their captors were less than human. But in the face of this kindness, this respect, their preconceived notions began to break down. The emotional complexity of these new relationships wasn't lost on anyone. The women tried to navigate this new terrain with caution, their minds racing to reconcile their old beliefs with the reality before them. The cowboys, too, found themselves in uncharted territory. They had been trained to view these women as prisoners, as symbols of an enemy they were fighting. Yet, the more they interacted with the women, the more they saw them as people. Each small act of kindness, each moment of shared humanity, added weight to a truth that none of them had expected to face. They were all human. And, perhaps more importantly, they were all just trying to survive. For the women, this realization was a bitter one. The idea of accepting kindness from their captors felt like betrayal. They had been taught to endure, to sacrifice, to hold on to their honor at all costs. Yet, in the face of these unspoken bonds, the idea of holding on to their pride seemed almost absurd. They were no longer just soldiers in a war. They were individuals, with needs, with emotions, with desires. The walls between them and their captors were beginning to crumble, slowly but unmistakably. As the days turned into weeks, the relationships between the women and the cowboys deepened. The small moments of camaraderie began to weave a quiet thread of connection, one that disrupted the established narrative of enemy and victim. It was an unspoken bond, one that neither side could fully articulate, but one that was undeniable. And with each passing day, the emotional weight of these moments grew heavier, forcing both captors and prisoners to confront the humanity they had long denied. It was an ordinary day. the kind that had come to feel like a strange new normal. The women were assigned their usual tasks, some in the fields, others by the barn. They had learned to move quietly, to perform their work without resistance. But that morning, something changed. As one woman, her hands shaking from exhaustion, dropped a sack of potatoes, the cowboy in charge of overseeing the work grew impatient. His voice, usually steady and calm, snapped out sharply. "Pick that up now!" he barked, his eyes narrowing. The woman, already on the edge of breaking, froze. The other women stood at a distance, eyes downcast, unable to intervene. For them, this was nothing new. The cowboys were still soldiers, and even the smallest mistake could mean a blow, a punishment. But this time, something was different. One of the cowboys, a man who had grown familiar to them over the weeks, stepped forward. His face, usually hard, softened with something unexpected: concern. He put a hand on the supervisor's arm, his grip firm but unthreatening. "That's enough," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of quiet authority. The supervisor, startled by the interruption, looked at him in disbelief. There was a pause, one of those moments where the world seemed to slow, as if the air itself held its breath. Then, the cowboy who had intervened turned his back on the supervisor and knelt beside the woman. Without a word, he helped her pick up the sack of potatoes, his hands gentle, as though the weight of the bag were the least of their concerns. The rest of the camp fell into an uneasy silence. For the women, the scene was almost too much to process. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty in every form, every gesture from their captors. The supervisor, who had moments before barked orders and made them feel less than human, now stood silent, watching this man defy military protocol for a woman who had been nothing more than an enemy in his eyes just a short time ago. The silence hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the world outside the camp seemed far away. As the cowboy helped the woman to her feet, the others watched in stunned silence. It wasn't just the act itself that shocked them. It was the humanity behind it. This man, a soldier who had every right to enforce the rules, had put his duty aside in favor of something deeper. It wasn't just kindness. It was empathy, an understanding that went beyond nationalities, beyond prisoners and captors. It was the unspoken recognition that this woman, though a prisoner, was not a thing to be controlled. She was a person, just like him. For the woman, the shock of the moment left her breathless. Her hands still shook, not from fear, but from the weight of something more profound. She had been taught that surrender meant subjugation, that her enemies would treat her as less than human. But here was this cowboy, kneeling beside her, not as a conqueror, but as a fellow human being. Slowly, she allowed herself to breathe again, her chest tight with confusion and reluctant relief. The other women, too, felt the shift. This moment, small but significant, cracked the facade of their hardened beliefs. They had seen soldiers defend their comrades before, but they had never seen a soldier risk punishment for a prisoner. It was an act that disrupted everything they had ever been taught. How could their enemies, these cowboys, these soldiers, be capable of this? What did this act mean for them? In the days that followed, the women no longer saw only captors and enemies. They began to see people. Their minds wrestled with the implications of this shift, but they couldn't deny the truth. The kindness, the understanding, the empathy, these were not things they had expected. And for the first time in weeks, they realized that perhaps they had been wrong about everything they had been taught. Maybe, just maybe, their captors were not the monsters they had believed them to be. But even as the new reality settled in, the ghosts of their pasts lingered. For all the changes happening within them, the memories of war, of loss, of fear, of grief, were too raw to ignore. Each of the women carried with them the weight of their history, the weight of a war that had taken everything from them. The world they had known was gone, and with it, their families, their homes, their sense of security, the propaganda they had been raised on, the promises of honor and victory had crumbled into dust. Yet the emotional scars they had borne through the war remained, a constant reminder of the world they had lost. The trauma was not just physical, it was psychological too. Every time they were treated with kindness by the cowboys, every time they were handed food or offered a word of reassurance, it brought to the surface memories of the war they had tried to forget. Memories of bombed cities, of broken families, of the endless suffering they had witnessed. They had been taught to endure, to suppress their emotions, to act as though they were invincible. But in this quiet ranch, surrounded by people they had once called enemies, their emotions began to surface, raw and unguarded. One woman, who had once been a secretary in a small office in Tokyo, remembered the first air raid that had hit the city. She had been sitting at her desk, filling out reports, when the ground had shaken beneath her. The sound of the bombers, the scream of the sirens, the chaos that had followed it was all so vivid in her mind, as though it had just happened yesterday. She had run to the basement, hiding with her colleagues, praying that the building would not collapse. The terror had been so intense that she had not even been able to cry. There was no time for tears in a war. There was only time for survival. And then there was the moment of surrender. She had been one of the last to leave the office, her eyes darting nervously between the soldiers and the smoke rising in the distance. The fear had been palpable, a gnawing anxiety that threatened to swallow her whole. She had been told that if they surrendered, they would be treated as less than human. She had been told that the Americans would make them suffer. And yet, as she stood there on the ranch, surrounded by the very men she had been taught to fear, she found herself questioning everything. Was it possible that all she had been told was a lie? For others, the memories were just as haunting. One woman had been a nurse during the war, tending to soldiers and civilians alike as bombs fell around her. The sound of planes had become a constant presence in her life, and the stench of blood and smoke had clung to her skin. She had lost so many people, friends, comrades, strangers, and with each death, she had grown numb. She had been trained to shut off her emotions, to focus on the task at hand. But deep inside, she carried a weight that no one could see. The fear of death had been constant, but so had the fear of what came after. And so, each day, they took small steps forward. Even as the past continued to haunt them, they learned to accept the kindness, to allow themselves to experience it without guilt. They learned that survival was not just about fighting, but about adapting to a new reality, one where their captors were not monsters, but human beings. It was a slow, painful process, but with each passing day, the women found themselves changing. They began to accept the future not as something to fear, but as something to shape, and in doing so, they began to heal, piece by piece, just as the world around them slowly began to rebuild. But even as they moved forward, a deeper, more troubling question began to rise. It lingered at the edge of their thoughts, creeping into the quiet moments when the work of the day was done, when the camp settled into its rhythm, and the world outside seemed to disappear. The question wasn't just about their captors or about survival. It was about humanity itself. If these men, the very enemy they had been taught to hate, could show them such compassion, what did that say about their own people? The question gnawed at them, relentlessly. They had been raised to believe in a stark division between good and evil, between the righteous and the corrupt. In their minds, there was no gray area. The enemy was supposed to be devoid of mercy, incapable of compassion. And yet, here they were, experiencing the very things they had been taught to fear. The first stirrings of doubt had come when one of the cowboys had stepped forward to protect a POW, risking punishment to defend her. That moment had shaken their worldview, but it had also planted a seed, one that was beginning to sprout in unexpected ways. As more acts of kindness followed, the women began to question the very foundation of their beliefs. If their captors could act with mercy, what did that mean about the warriors they had once revered? One evening, as the sun set behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp, one of the women found herself sitting alone in the mess hall, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. She had been taught that the enemy was savage, that compassion was a weakness, and that showing mercy meant inviting destruction. Yet, as she watched a cowboy from the corner of her eye, gently helping a fellow POW to her feet after she had stumbled, something inside her shifted. The cowboy's actions were deliberate, thoughtful. There was no hesitation, no mocking, just quiet care. It was then that the realization hit her. Mercy was not weakness. Compassion was not a flaw. In that moment, the women began to see their captors not as mere soldiers, but as men who possessed a kind of nobility, a nobility they had not been taught to expect. These cowboys, these men they had once feared, were capable of showing the kind of humanity their own country had failed to show them, and it shook them to their core. For the first time, they began to understand that there was more to a person than their uniform, their rank, or their nationality. The true measure of a person, they realized, was in their ability to show kindness, to offer respect, even in the face of war. The women, who had been raised in a culture that placed honor above all else, now found themselves grappling with a new understanding of what it meant to be human. But accepting this new truth came with its own set of challenges. The internal conflict was fierce. The women were caught between their ingrained beliefs, which had taught them to view the enemy with disdain, and the growing realization that their captors were, in many ways, better than the men they had fought alongside. How could they reconcile the compassion they were witnessing with the harsh realities they had been taught? How could they reconcile their duty to their country with the empathy they now felt for the very men they had been trained to hate? The battle within them was not easily won. It was not just a matter of seeing the cowboys as human. It was about questioning everything they had ever known. They had been taught to fear the enemy, to fight with unwavering loyalty to their country, and to never show weakness. But now, they were beginning to see that loyalty didn't have to come at the expense of humanity. It wasn't a betrayal to care for another person, even if that person was once considered an enemy. Do you find this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. As time went on, the women began to see the change within themselves. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift that crept into their thoughts when they least expected it. The fear and suspicion that had originally defined their existence on the ranch began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of understanding not just of their captors, but of themselves. They had been thrust into a world of contradictions, forced to face their beliefs about honor, survival, and humanity. And as the days passed, they found that the lessons they had learned in war were not the only truths. In this strange new world, new truths had begun to emerge, challenging everything they had been taught. The most profound change, however, was in how they saw themselves. They were no longer simply victims of war, no longer just prisoners to be broken. They had discovered something deeper within themselves, a resilience that went beyond survival. They had learned to be human again, to find compassion and dignity, even in the darkest places. What had begun as a desperate struggle to endure had transformed into something else entirely, an awakening. They had awakened to the complexity of their captors, yes, but also to the complexity of the world they had once known, and the world they were now navigating. Each woman, in her own way, had begun to understand the depth of this transformation. They had started as soldiers with one goal in mind: to survive, to return to their country, and to serve their emperor. But now, as they looked at the cowboys, no longer enemies, but men who had shown them respect and kindness, they realized that survival was no longer enough. They had changed, and the world around them had changed too. The things they once believed to be absolute truths now felt fragile, shifting beneath the weight of experience. One woman, who had once been a radio operator, found herself standing in front of the mess hall one afternoon, staring out across the ranch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields, and she watched as the cowboys worked alongside the other POWs, laughing, sharing stories, and passing around small gifts. She had once viewed these men with fear and hatred, convinced that they were nothing more than agents of destruction. But now she saw them as something more, as men who, despite their roles in a cruel war, could show kindness, compassion, and even warmth. It was a realization that shook her to her core. How had she ever believed that the enemy was incapable of humanity? It wasn't just the cowboys who had changed in her eyes. It was the world itself. She had come to see that not all enemies were the same. The war, which had once felt so black and white, had now revealed itself to be filled with shades of gray. The kindness she had been shown had forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth. The people she had been taught to despise were not so different from her. After all, they too had families, hopes, and dreams. They too had suffered. In the face of such understanding, she found that the enemy no longer existed as an abstract concept. Instead, they had become real, complex individuals, just like her. In that world, they had come to terms with their captivity. They had been broken, yes, but in the process of being rebuilt, they had discovered their own humanity. And with that understanding came the acceptance of their new reality. Their future was uncertain, but they had learned to navigate it with newfound strength, with the recognition that survival was no longer about simply enduring. It was about embracing the complexity of the world they now inhabited and finding a way to thrive within it. The women had changed, and so had the world they lived in. The boundaries that had once divided them, enemy and prisoner, soldier and civilian, had become blurred. In their place was a new world, one where kindness could exist even in the darkest of places, where a soldier could show mercy and a prisoner could give and receive respect. As the final days in captivity began to pass, the women found themselves caught between two worlds. One was the world they had come to know on the ranch, where they had learned the value of kindness, of empathy, of humanity. The other was the world they would return to, a world where honor, duty, and loyalty were the ideals that defined their existence. They had been away for so long, their hearts and minds had been forever changed. And now they faced the painful reality of leaving behind the strange comfort they had found in captivity. The emotional complexity of leaving was undeniable. Their time at the ranch had given them more than just survival. It had given them a sense of belonging, of community, of human connection. The cowboys, once their enemies, had become more than just captors. They had become people who had shown them kindness when they least expected it. And now, as the time to leave approached, the women were faced with the conflicting feelings of loyalty to their homeland and the quiet sorrow of parting from the unexpected bonds they had formed. How could they leave this place, this strange haven, where they had learned to embrace their humanity and return to the cold, harsh world they had known before? Their final days on the ranch were filled with quiet goodbyes. The women exchanged small gestures of affection with the cowboys, a handshake, a shared laugh, a gentle pat on the back. In these moments, the weight of their transformation was clear. They had come to this place as enemies, but they were leaving it as something different. They were leaving with memories of kindness, of mercy, and of the recognition that humanity could be found in the most unexpected of places. As they boarded the ship back home, the women carried with them more than just physical mementos. They had letters, small gifts, and tokens from the cowboys, simple things, but things that had come to symbolize their transformation. A hand-carved wooden figurine, a photograph taken on the last day of their captivity, a letter from a cowboy, written in broken Japanese, expressing his gratitude for their time together. These gifts were more than just souvenirs. They were reminders of the bonds they had formed, of the unexpected humanity they had encountered, and of the profound shift in their perception of the world. When they arrived in Japan, the world that awaited them was vastly different from the one they had left behind. Their country was in ruins, their families scattered, their futures uncertain. They would be expected to embrace the ideals of loyalty, honor, and duty that had once defined their lives. But in their hearts, they carried the quiet knowledge that survival was not just about loyalty to a country or an ideal, it was about embracing humanity, even in the face of war. They had learned that kindness could exist even in the most unlikely places, and that, more than anything else, would shape their future perceptions of the world and the war. If you were moved by this story, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your thoughts and feedback mean a lot to us, and we're so grateful for your engagement in remembering this powerful part of history.